Closet, a Todd Mills mystery. Book 1. Author R.D. Zimmerman. Publisher Scribble Pub. Minneapolis, Minnesota. Narrator Eric Aust. Chapter 10. So they thought Todd Mills had done it. How fucking unbelievable. Incredible, really. The little things in life offered the biggest rewards, or something like that. His grandmother had had all sorts of little wisdoms, most of which he dismissed. But the old lady had been right on this one. By God, the one about the little stuff in life was absolutely true. The man who'd most definitely been the last person to see Michael Carter alive now sat behind the locked door of his apartment, staring at the front page of the Tribune. It was early afternoon as he sat reading the paper over and over. He still couldn't believe it. It had been on the radio and television as well. A little feeding frenzy of guess who's fucking who. He'd been so worried, had taken every precaution he could imagine so that no one would spot him and the police wouldn't be able to trace him. Obviously, he'd done it all right. It was good, too, that he made Michael undress before doing him, for it made it look like a passionate crime. But Todd Mills, they thought Todd Mills had knifed Michael Carter? Holy shit, it was too good to be true. Why hadn't he had the brains to set it up that way? Then again, if he had tried, he probably would have blown it and been caught, so it was better this way. Totally unexpected, a surprise reward for a job well done. He dropped the paper in his lap, felt another wave of smug pride. It had also never occurred to him that he would be this exhausted after doing Michael. It was the release, he supposed. Even now, not even 24 hours later, he felt so relieved, so spent. For weeks he'd been anticipating last night. The sheer inevitability of it had loomed before him each day. The suspense of when and how had been unbearable. But now that it was over, he felt like celebrating. And he felt like having a cigarette, too. Still chuckling to himself, he pushed himself out of his chair and passed into his kitchen. It was a little box of an apartment, identical to all the other ones in the building, a 2.5-story walk-up built in the early 70s. It was comfortable enough, particularly given how little time he actually spent there. He reached the dark wood cabinets, pulled open a drawer. There it was, the knife, just lying there with the big ladle, the grater, the can opener. Of course, he'd never use it again for carving meat, not after last night. He wasn't some sicko after all. He'd come home and washed the blade thoroughly, then put on a spaghetti pot of water, brought it to a boil and dropped the knife into it and let it cook for a minute or two. He guessed he should eventually get rid of it, but there certainly weren't any traces of Michael or his clothing left on it after all that, and what better place to hide it than with the ladle and grater and can opener. He always knew he was smart, and this proved it. He thought, reaching past the knife for a half-empty pack of cigarettes that languished at the back of the drawer. He'd quit smoking, what was it, 5 years ago? But he still allowed himself 2 cigarettes a month. That was nothing, really. Down from a pack a day, and he allowed himself 2 smokes a month. Not merely for the carnal pleasure, but to show that he had real control. He wasn't like those wimps in all those stop smoking groups, the ones who needed to be babied along. No, not him. Just like everything else, he did it all alone. Grandma would be proud, so very proud. He dragged a match over a burner on the stove, lit up a cig, and took a deep, soulful drag. The rich, hot smoke filled his lungs. He held it, let it burn his lungs, and strolled out of the kitchen through the living room and to the sliding glass door that opened onto the balcony. He pulled the door back a bit, leaned forward, let the smoke spew and steam out into the cool afternoon air. No sense in smoking up the joint. There was at least one more guy he wanted to do, and if there were others who knew too much, he'd do them too. Just as he'd done with Michael, he'd been studying the next one, a fat, lonely guy, for weeks. He knew where Mr. Number 2 lived, where he worked, even when he went to sleep. He knew that and so much more. Once, right in the middle of the day, he'd even stopped over at the guy's house and thumbed through his mail. That had been dumb. One of the neighbors could have seen him, but he couldn't resist. Anyway, that was almost a month ago, and he had to know everything. Now that he did, it was time to whack him. so to speak. Yes, he had to do it. Had to. It was an obsession. He understood that much, but an obsession born of necessity, and he had to take care of this next man. He sucked on the cigarette until his head grew light. That was a real plus about smoking rarely. When you did have a cig, it made you kind of high. Oh, blessed life, he said to himself, loving every bit of this. Last night had gone better than he'd ever imagined. He tried to anticipate it all, tried to make a plan or a schedule. But now that he'd finished with Michael, everything was different. Not at all as he'd expected. This side of murder was entirely different than he'd ever thought. Beforehand, he was sure he'd have to wait a few months, maybe even 6, before he could get up the nerve to start after his next target. He'd even considered the possibility that after he'd killed for the first time, he wouldn't be able to do it again. But that wasn't the case. Not at all. He was actually eager. Cigarette in his mouth, he turned from the sliding glass door and headed over to his chair. The picture now. Where was it? He lifted up a couple of books, pushed aside a coaster. Yes, there it was on the side table. It didn't mean much, not at all. All he had was this one photograph, a small one, and even if the police raided his apartment and found this snapshot, it certainly wasn't going to prove anything. Nevertheless, what had Grandma always said when she'd measured and remeasured flour for her cakes? You can't be too careful. No, sirree. It was an adage that had served her well, and him too. Photo in hand, he returned to the kitchen, struck another match, and held it to the picture. The flame took to the paper, crawling up and around the image of a very heavy man in his late 30s and capturing it with fire. He turned to the sink, held the burning thing over the drain. Of course, this man knew Michael. They'd been good friends for a long time. Actually, pinching the burning photograph by the very edge, he held it until the very last minute. Mr. Number 2 was going to be easy. He worked hard, lived alone, was in terrible shape. There had been no lover in his life for a long time, perhaps years. He might even beg for it. Yes, this target would be that excited, so delighted that another living and breathing soul had taken an interest in him. Christ! He'd probably be down on his knees, screaming, "Give it to me! Oh, God, give it to me!" And he was going to get it. No doubt about that. Only one problem. This one was a real talker, a gabber, who loved to expound on everything and anything. He'd tell the world all of his joys and woes as loudly as he could, so now the man resolved he'd have to sneak over after the bars had closed. Nothing said beforehand. Absolutely not. And no seeing him beforehand whatsoever. No way. Yes, that was the way it would be. Only with one twist. God, this was great. Okay, so he didn't have the ideal at first, but at least he was smart enough to pick up on a terrific thing. Namely, if Todd Mills had taken the fall so easily for the first murder, well, why not the second? He just happened to drop a little something of Todd's at the murder site. A little something that he so happened to have in his possession. Even if the police didn't jump on it, the media most certainly would. And it would turn into a real circus. With that in mind, he glanced at his watch. Oh shit, it was almost time. He dropped the photo into the sink, turned on the water as well as the disposal, and then flushed the remains of the pitcher down the roaring drain. He dropped his cigarette butt down too and turned and hurried into the living room, where he switched on the small color TV. It was almost time for the midday news, and the talk of Todd Mills was sure to be juicy. Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold. To offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides. And in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.